Hello everybody, thanks for joining us. I've got two sections for today, and first I'm going to talk for a while about some of the things that you can do that you're probably already doing a little bit of in your work in class that will be particularly helpful for neurodiverse learners. And then we're going to have a short Q&A, probably about 15 minutes at the end. So if you have a question that you would like, particularly questions that come up as I go through the pre-prepared material, please email ask@aspurposeful.com.au, and one of my colleagues is going to go through that and pick out probably about 9 or 10 questions or so, and then we'll go through them at the end. So let's get started with the presentation.
All right, so what we're going to focus on today is some immediate support, particularly now that we've got people coming back to classrooms. And so we're going to think a little bit about activating strengths, specifically in the neurodiversity context, then some specific strategies, and finally I'm going to talk a little bit about purpose. Just a little bit about me before we get started. My main interests are in translational research and also in lived experience. So that means combining the evidence-based practices, what we've got coming out of academic literature, with the real world, with the sorts of things that we might actually need to do with people in classrooms or in our case in training. So that means that I'm forever looking at what we might be able to get that's new, what we might be able to adapt, and really trying to package that together into things that might be useful for people such as yourselves. All right, so focusing on strengths. Before we get started, I thought it would be good just to talk for a minute about what neurodiversity is. It's a real buzzword that's been going around in recent years. So my colleague Judy Singer, who you see on the screen here, she coined this word back in the late 90s, and it brings the idea of biodiversity into the human sphere. This idea that you have to have lots of all sorts of different types of plants and animals in the biosphere in order to have a healthy and successful environment. When we bring that into the human space, the same is true for brains. If we all think the same way, if we all have the same ideas, if we all have the same needs, then humanity will not succeed. We need that diversity. So it's a really important change from the way we used to think about these sorts of things. And there's a slide for this. In the old days, in the old ways, we would really think about people who are neurodivergent as being deficient. Something's wrong, something might need to be fixed. And so when we're thinking about that in the classroom sense, we're often thinking about what can we do for that one or two specific students and really micro-targeting on them. And so when we move into those newer principles, we're moving away from that deficit focus. We're going to start thinking a little bit differently about, well, what can we do? What strengths can we use? And how can we do this in a universal way? And specifically with choice, which you'll see in the example. One of the things that's common for people who are neurodivergent is that they do find it easier to focus on interests. For those of you who have students with autism, you'll probably notice this quite readily. But it's also true for young people with attention deficit disorder, ADHD. Hyperfocus is a real strength. So if we're thinking about this in the old way, we'd be thinking about what can we do that's different for this one student. We're thinking about it in the new way, we can take that same task that we're about to do to create a slightly different set of materials for this one student and think about it holistically for all students. We can have a choice for the entire class. We can have the ones we're going to do already and the ones that are a little bit more customized. We can actually give that choice to every student, and that's going to change the way that we're approaching the task and make it a bit more applicable. When we're thinking about customizing materials, when we're thinking about giving people a choice, we're going to find, and the research is very clear on this, we're going to find there are some very positive outcomes. That's actually going to help everybody, because now we're providing that choice and control that is so important to all young people, regardless of whether they've got a label or not. So we've started with a deficit focus. This student can't continue until we create some customized materials. Once we move into a strengths-based focus, we can think about not just this one student, but actually all the students. Is there something that our student who has a few extra needs, who's neurodivergent, has in an interest that is actually shared by other people in the class, that's going to give them a choice as well? And now we can provide something which is actually going to potentially be useful for the entire class. Even if every other student chooses the materials we're already going to have, they've actively chosen. They're now buying into the process of the learning that we're trying to impart. So it's taking things that we probably already do a little bit and thinking about it in new ways, with this overarching theme of diversity and choice. Very important principles that you're probably already doing a little bit of, and now we're going to really double down on. When we do that, and again, the literature is very clear on this, we're going to find that there are a lot of positive benefits throughout all of the class, not just for the young person or a couple of young people who are neurodivergent. It's going to work for our neurotypicals as well, and bonus points. And I think very importantly, this stuff also supports teacher well-being. You'll probably find that there's a little bit of a benefit to you as well, as we're starting to do things we're probably already doing in this new way and thinking about it in this more inclusive fashion. So that's the framework that we're using, not only for today, but also for our long-form training product, Aspire, for teachers and schools. And so if you want to find out more about that, you can go to our website, aspurposeful.com.au/go/schools. Moving along now to what we can do to actually help today here in this webinar. One of the things we find when we look in the literature is that resilience is built on two key things, and this is true for neurotypical students, neurodiverse students, and teachers. You can see it there, relationships and choice and control. And so that's fairly straightforward to think about. Let's see how it plays out in a case study. So here is Aoife. And so Aoife has autism. And what you'll notice in this quote is that those two factors are becoming related. The relationships, her relationships with her family, it is in this case, she goes into class and she can't settle until she knows, she says, that her family, her relatives are safe. So there's a kind of a control problem she's got until she's really certain she's got that kind of rigid thinking, and she's going to have trouble settling down. So that's clearly a challenge. When we move then into activating strengths, what can we do about this? One of the things that's clear in the literature, and by now you can tell I love looking at the literature, we find across time and across culture and across interest groups, teachers and students, that gratitude is a strength that can be leveraged across the board. Gratitude is a positive emotion, and it's something that can actually be leveraged to do some of the work that we might need to do for Aoife and also for others. And so for Aoife specifically, what I'd be thinking about here is getting her to think about this problem that we have, this challenge she has, in a new way. Aoife is fairly anxious. We can tell from this kind of concern. She comes into class like, where is everybody? I have to know where everybody is before I can get going. If we get Aoife to think every day for a number of weeks, this will probably be an ongoing thing, about yesterday, about how grateful she is that yesterday when we checked, actually everybody was where they were supposed to be. Everybody was safe. That's good. I can be grateful for that. And then tomorrow the same, and the day after the same. So Aoife will build up a lived experience of gratitude day after day after day, because we've set this up as a strategy. And eventually what we'll hopefully find is that that will be reassuring for her. She'll have a memory every day of coming to class and thinking, you know what, isn't it great that everybody's where they're supposed to be, my family's safe, and now I can get to work. Not going to be a huge win immediately, I suspect, but over time, I think we can use gratitude, that skill that we know is there, that strength that we know is there, to help Aoife reduce her anxiety a little bit when she is in class. This is also true for teachers. One of the things I like to do a lot, and you'll see it here, I like to think about not only students, but also teachers and what we have in common. So this here is a quote from Paula. And like many teachers, probably like you, if you're watching this today, you've been significantly, I would imagine, impacted by COVID. And so Paula has a concern that she really hasn't been as effective as she would like, and she thinks her students probably didn't benefit as much as she would like. If we think about this in a gratitude framework, there are some hints there about where we could start to build a more positive lived experience for Paula in the same way we've done for Aoife. Paula clearly has relationships with her students. That's how she knows that they've been suffering. She's been following that carefully. She feels that there's a problem there, and that's why she's upset. And so I think for Paula, in the same way as we had for Aoife, there's an opportunity there to think about, well, what can we be grateful for? And in this case, as you see there, it would be her relationships with her students. As they are coming back to class now, those strong relationships will help her to help them make that gap up. I think those relationships are something that she can be and should be very grateful for. So if we do another one, this is Mariam. And Mariam has a slightly different concern. She feels that her students have been really disadvantaged by having to be at home by themselves. Maybe their parents have had to go to work. Maybe they've been unsupervised, and she thinks that particularly when they go back into lockdown, if there are problems that require them to go back home for a bit, that's going to continue to be a problem. And she's probably right. So then for Mariam, the opportunity for gratitude is to think about, well, what is working a little bit at home when those students are there by themselves, maybe with a parent who is busy working, doesn't really have a lot of time to be able to supervise them well. There will be small things that are working for these students. And so I think the first task for Mariam here is actually to ask her students, what is working, even if it's only a teeny tiny little bit? I think that's going to help her students to actually go, you know what, this isn't as big of a catastrophe as it could be. There are actually things that are helping me to keep on going, to do my work even though I'm by myself, to access support. And I think that will also help Mariam not only to feel a little bit happier, but also then to take that experience, that knowledge, and roll it out for her students in the future if they do have to go into quarantine, for example. So I'm going to finish this block with a story. I love this story. Danielle here has had a great idea. Kids are back in class at this point. This is a year 8 class. And she decided she was going to make a gratitude wall with these little post-it notes and get all the students to write notes. And what you can see there is that this didn't just work for the students. This didn't just work even just for Danielle. This worked for everybody else as well, all the other teachers. What we found was that this was a great way of making everybody just a little bit happier and getting people to express things consciously that they probably wouldn't necessarily have a framework to do, to really give everybody that positive boost. And I think that's a really great story here about how we can use gratitude to not only solve problems that we've got immediately, but also to create a more positive atmosphere around the board. It's just a really great story about how we can do some really unexpected things sometimes. All right, so if we're thinking about strengths, we're thinking about, well, what tools do we have in the toolkit to be able to start conversations and move forward? If we think now specifically about strategies, what can we do in the classroom? How can we start to really make more of a difference if we've got neurodiverse, neurodivergent learners? What we're going to do now is we're going to focus on some strategies that were evidence-based strategies that were put out by the Victorian Department of Education. And there'll be a link a little bit later on our website for this document. These are high impact teaching strategies. Now, what I've done for this block is to look through this document and to highlight some of the strategies that not only work well in general, but are going to be specifically useful for neurodivergent students. And we're going to go through 5 of them, and you can see them here. So the numbers in the brackets there, that's the effect size. That's how well they work essentially. And you can see that these are all fairly effective strategies overall. All right, moving on to strategy number 1. So you're going to notice all these strategies, particularly the first 3. These are very easy to understand. You're definitely doing them already. What we're talking about here is a little bit more specificity to make these strategies as good as they can be for neurodivergent students. And so clarity here, our first example, very easy to understand, but the one that I want to highlight here is the why. I want to highlight some of the challenges that we can have for neurodiverse students, literal meanings, understanding sarcasm and gestures, right? So the idea that we might need to be really, really, really specific, really, really, really clear, well beyond what we might otherwise need to do, that does seem particularly relevant. Now, the good news is, as with all of these strategies, this is also going to benefit our neurotypical students, the entire class. They might not need the level of clarity that we're going to be talking about for our neurodivergent learners, for our students that have a few more needs, but they are going to have benefits from the extra clarity, even if it's around the margins. This is going to be useful for everybody, and it's going to have an outsized benefit for the neurodiverse students amongst your class. All right, number 2, feedback. Again, everybody gives feedback, not hard to think about. What we're talking about in this strategy, once again, is that level of detail. Now, in addition to that, there's a specific strategy that is going to be useful here, which is to compare. See how well you've come along, because remember, last time it wasn't quite as good. Helping people, a lot of neurodiverse students live in the moment, particularly when things are not going well. And so helping to identify those little gains, little by little, particularly over time, that's going to be very useful as a feedback strategy. And so if you use the feedback sandwich, one of those sorts of, positive stuff, corrective model, and then positive stuff, we talk about this more in the teacher's training course. This can be part of the raw material for a strategy like that. So again, if we're thinking about our neurodivergent students specifically, there's a real need there for that precise information. And there's also some challenges in terms of actually engaging with the social world. And so providing that really clear feedback and being positive about it as much as possible, that can be really useful for our neurodivergent students. Once again, all young people love praise. We talk about this a lot in the teachers training course. And so really focusing on that is a very important part of the feedback strategy overall in these particular instances. Strategy 3, space practice. Again, not going to win any awards here. What we're talking about, I think specifically though, is the scaffolding. This is something that comes out of the original source material from the Victorians. We're going through examples bit by bit, very, very clearly, probably written down, probably gone through with the entire class, and we're doing that in multiple ways so that people can follow along, see the steps live, and that's really going to reduce anxiety and make students think, actually, maybe I can do this, I'm following along, right? So that's not necessarily going to work for everybody. None of these things work for everybody, but certainly really being clear, using that clarity strategy, using the feedback strategy as they're going through sort of co-worked examples, that can be very, very helpful. And as you can see there, the research says very clearly that that will consolidate longer term gains. So for the last two strategies, we're going to move into things that are a little bit more complicated and a little bit more specific. So when we're talking about classroom discussion, when talking about some very specific strategies now that are designed to surface all of the things that might otherwise be hidden, particularly for neurodivergent learners that have trouble understanding the hidden curriculum. There's a quote here from one of the papers you'll see referenced on the screen. It's important to differentiate between telling students how to act versus making them aware of social courtesies, constructs, cues, and changes to routines to assist them so they can successfully engage with their peers, the curriculum, and the broader community. So what that means, plainly spoken, is we have to actually model all this stuff, and specifically in this instance, those metacognitive skills, so that it's very clear what tools are going to be used to then do the work later. In terms of the specifics, we've got that concept mapping. So this is actually going out onto the board and whatever tools are being used and actually mapping out all of the concepts bit by bit. Again, those building blocks, making sure that we're all on the same page. We've all got the bits of information that we need, the skills, they're all pre-taught so that when we're actually doing the new stuff, we can then have a positive experience. And then, because it's a discussion, once we've sort of modeled the intellectual tools that are going to be needed, and so for younger children, this is probably going to be fairly simple stuff. For older students, it'll probably be a bit more theoretical, a bit more complicated. Once we've done that, then we need to provide a bridge into the discussion itself using the think, pair, share strategy. And so this is specifically chosen now for neurodivergent learners, but it's going to help all students, and particularly students that have a little bit of anxiety, which is a lot of them. Think, pair, share works in 3 stages. Not going to win any awards there. We've got the open-ended question that's posed, and then students are encouraged then to write for a couple of minutes, specifically to write now their thoughts down on a piece of paper, or however things are written these days. Then the pairing, they share that written commentary, those written ideas with their partner, and ideally praise their partner for their ideas. Praise, again, in a student context, something we talk about a lot in the teachers course, but here, generally speaking, students are going to have some sort of good idea that a partner can go, that's pretty good. So once they've had that positive experience, sharing their idea with their partner and hearing their partner's own idea and going, that's pretty good as well, that's the point at which the student is able to share whatever it is they've come up with the entire class in the broader discussion. So it provides a really clear structure. It's neurodiversity, we love structure, and that's going to help students that need a bit more support to meaningfully contribute to class discussions. And it's also a great structure for everybody else as well. So very, very specifically concept mapping, and then think, pair, share. Now, the final one is actually a framework rather than a specific strategy. In the original document, it's called Response to Intervention, RTI. I've relabeled a differentiation because I think RTI is a bit of a technical term. What it essentially is the 3 tiers. A lot of schools now use this for behavior. So we're thinking now PBL, positive behavior for learning, talk about this incessantly in our teacher training. In terms of content though, in terms of teaching, the same idea can actually be applied to teaching and learning. And so what we'll find here is that it's helping us to think about the way we're creating materials for teaching, doing some of that choice and control in new and interesting ways. And it's a little bit theoretical, this one. I don't think this summary is particularly helpful in terms of understanding how it would work. And so there's another slide here I'm going to share with you folks, which is an example. So this is just an example. The 3 tiers are going to be different depending on the age range and what's being taught. But I think this example gives us quite a bit of stuff to talk about. So at the first tier in the example, we've got a lot of stuff we've been talking about already: the clarity, the classroom discussion, the space practice, and specifically the space practice gives us that skill assessment that we need so we can accurately sort our students into these tiers. So it's slightly repurposed, and we've got the underlying philosophical basis for it all, which is purposeful teaching, which we'll talk about in the next block. And then the meat of it is actually video instruction. Everybody has been doing online learning stuff now for some years. And so I think recording materials become pretty common. So in this example, and this is evidence-based, so it's from one of the papers you see referenced here, the teacher's actually taken that approach as the sort of self-directed learning approach for people in tier 1. So they do all of the stuff you would do to set it up class-wide, so the demonstrating, the classroom discussion, whatever's appropriate, but the video playback is then available to all of the students at tier 1, so they can watch it once and get it, watch it over again, pause, whatever it is that's relevant for them. And that allows the teacher to then go and spend quite a bit of their time in this particular version, this particular example with tier 2. And so in tier 2, these are the students that need a little bit more help. The teacher's actually going around to little groups of students. And bear in mind, this is a single class, so we're probably talking for our 15% couple of groups, if not only one. But these are groups perhaps of students that have particular shared challenges or needs, so they're grouped together. So our teacher is able to spend quite a bit of time with those 2 groups to supplement the video instruction. And then at tier 3, it gets really interesting. It's peer mediated instruction. And so there's actually a download poster for this, which will be in the link you get a little bit later on. And so for this one, it's very structured. We take our students that are the most likely to be at the top of tier 1, the most likely to totally get it after a couple of goes, and they are going to provide very structured, so it's got to be set up well, there's a bit of prep here, but very structured peer tutoring to the students, the couple of students at tier 3, it's only 5% of the class, so we're talking probably 1 or 2 students, in order to coach them over the line. And so that's going to do a couple of things. First of all, it's going to give the students that are otherwise going to be very bored at tier 1 something to do which is positive for them and positive for others. It's going to build positive relationships between the students that are the most at risk of not having them with peer mentors, and it's going to provide a very clear structure so that they can then learn back and forth. Peer mediated instruction is a very useful tool specifically for neurodiversity, and it's widely acceptable when it's for teachers when it's applied in classrooms. So hopefully that's a clearer understanding then of how differentiation, how our RTI might work, even though this is only a particular example, and the tiers do need to be thought about in each individual case. So to wrap that up, I've got a quote here from Michael, and Michael says, you know what, it's not my favorite. Ultimately, I'd much prefer something a little bit more standard. In his case, it's direct instruction. But what I think is really interesting here is how well it seems to be working. What he's found is the modeling and then the monitoring is actually starting to help quite a bit to allow his tier 1 students to become much more self-directed. And so that's then allowing him to go off and really provide that close support for students at higher tiers, tier 2 and potentially tier 3. He's seeing it's working, and I think that's a fairly realistic take. There is work to be done. It's perhaps not quite as simple as it could be, but it has a really clear benefit, and that's true not only for Michael, but also in the 1.07 score for the effectiveness in the original source document from the Victorian government. Speaking of which, talked about a couple of downloads. So if you go to that link there, aspurposeful.com.au/go/impacts, you'll see links to download the peer mediated instruction poster, which is very clear instructions to help you with that tool, regardless of whether it's in a tiered structure or not. Peer mediated instruction will hopefully be very useful for you, but also the full high impact teaching strategies document to really get into some of those details and understand how they're working in a holistic framework. It's a great document. Going to wrap this one up with another quote. As you can probably tell by now, I do love qualitative data. I think it's really helpful to illuminate some of the things that we're thinking about when we're looking at adapting evidence-based practices. I love this quote from Charlie because he's talking about that clarity and that feedback. And he's actually saying that he's got autism, I think is my recollection. He's actually saying he likes the honesty. He doesn't want stuff to be sugar-coated. He wants it to be done respectfully and honestly and in a way which is actually going to help him learn. I think this is a really great insight into the way that many neurodivergent students think about what they're wanting from us when we're working with them, because I think sometimes the instinct is to try and be as kind as possible. And I think what Charlie is talking about here is important. The kindness can actually be paired with the real deal. I think that's actually something that he appreciates, and chances are your neurodivergent students will as well. All right. Let's talk now about the theoretical underpinning for all of this, the idea of being purposeful in our work. So at AS Purposeful, our model is passion providing purpose. And so that's our motto, but it's also the structure of our programs. It's how we design everything that we do. We're really passionate about inclusion. That's the passion underlying. But then we've got to think about, well, how can we actually do that? And you can see what we're about is taking the strategies that are available, the evidence-based practices, and trying to make them meaningful. So the passion is then informed by the provision, the strategies, the research, the qualitative data. And then that's giving us our purpose. It's giving us our positive results. It's giving us that gratitude, not only that we can be seeing that the good work we're doing is going out into the world and being used by, in this case, the teachers that we're working with, but also that it's then giving us information about what's working, that sort of focus on what it is that we're grateful for as we're doing this work, that can help guide us in terms of how we customize materials, how we develop new services, how we work with the people that come to us for support. So that real purpose, that strength of mission, that is very much a part of the model. So passion, providing purpose. Because what we're really talking about is something which is true for you as teachers as well. It's really a values play. It's about recognizing what our values are, recognizing what we're passionate about, focusing on those values, using the tools that are available to really focus on what it is that we will need to be doing, and then acting on our values. Gratitude is an act. It's a purposeful, deliberate thing. When we're thinking about what's working and why, what we hope to achieve, what we are achieving, that's a value statement. That is about gratitude, and it's about saying, you know what, we should actually focus on what's going well, what our purpose is, the fact that we are achieving, even if it's only a tiny little bit of what we're setting out to do. That's a purposeful thing, and I think you'll find it's purposeful for you as well in the classroom. When we think then about what teacher values are, here are some of the things that the literature tells us teachers value: respect, compassion, inclusivity. Have a think about what your values are. Have a think about what they were at the beginning of your career and what they are now. Have they changed? Have they grown? Have you found that you've matured in the way that your value mix is causing you to approach your work? Have a think about that. So I've got another quote here. This is from Hanzo, and it really talks about the way that his teachers' values, that structure and the sorts of tools that we've been talking about, underpinned by a sense of purpose, are really playing out in the classroom. And in Hanzo's case, he's pretty happy, and he thinks actually that all his teachers should be like the one that he's talking about. Clearly, there is a value chain underlying Hanzo's teachers' work, and Hanzo can sense it. But what's interesting here, and he has autism, is that he's not entirely sure what it is. He can't quite put his finger on it, but he can see it's there all the same. Your neurodivergent students, all your students, don't necessarily need to entirely get it. They can sense the passion and the purpose and their gratitude. They can sense all of that coming together for them. So if you go to that link, and it'll come up again in a minute, aspurposeful.com.au/go/impacts, you'll find a downloadable worksheet that helps walk you through some of these things that we've been talking about, and thinking about some of the cases we've been looking at here today, and then applying some of the things that we're thinking about from those cases to your teaching. So I encourage you to download that worksheet and have a look through it. And so again, that's aspurposeful.com.au/go/impacts. That's available to download right now. So we've come to the end of this part of our webinar. There are some questions coming up. I gather from Naomi that some of them have been coming in. So we'll have a quick pause and we will answer some of your questions. So stay tuned.
So joining us now is my colleague Naomi Blair, and she has some of those questions that we were talking about earlier. So Naomi, what have we got?
Yes. Well, from Dorothy, she asks, are these kids really that rigid in their thinking, or is it just a power struggle?
Great question, Dorothy. So I think for this one, it's around understanding what we can see the young person, the student, actually doing. So generally we know when somebody's trying to push back a little bit and play a bit of a game, but if we can't explain it, if there's not really clear that that's what's happening, if they're not tee-heeing away or whatever it is, it's probably not that. So if it's really obviously a bit of an attempt like that, which is unusual, I have to say, Dorothy, then it's probably not an attempt at a power struggle. It's probably actually just what it appears to be, which is something else, anxiety, being overwhelmed or whatever.
Nice. And a good follow-up from that question is from Leah. I have an HFA student, or a high-functioning autism student, who mentally works through his homework, but then he forgets to write it down. What can I do?
I love this story. This is great. So it's really, really good. And what I love about it, just before I give an answer, is that this student clearly means well. Right? They're trying to do their homework. They're really trying very hard. And in fact, they're able to come back to class and tell Leah the answers, even though he didn't write it down apparently. Just love it. I really love it. So thank you for sending that in, Leah. I think that for this one, we probably need to think about a visual support to go home with the homework. So we probably need to have a little bit of an instruction sheet for this student. They clearly know what they're doing. They're clearly reading the homework to try and understand it. So a little bit of an instruction to go along with it. Don't forget to do this. And then perhaps demonstrating how that's going to work to the student before it goes home with them. Perhaps even involving the parent. Hey, this thing going home, and now we can use it to make everybody's life easier. I think a little bit of a visual support, Leah, would probably be a good start for that. And then the other thing is, make sure that we're praising this student when they come back to class, even if all they've done is exactly what they're doing now. Let's build that relationship a little bit so that it might be easier to slip in a little bit of constructive feedback once the student is used to coming back to class, reliably getting some praise out of it, and then thinking, I really like coming here, even if they haven't yet caught up on the homework issue.
Nice. Siobhan asks, how can I understand their thought process better so that I can intervene, so that I can either preempt or help them with it?
Oh, that's a good one. So I think with this one, Siobhan is trying to go all the way to the very end, at the very beginning. If there's some behaviour that she's not really able to yet explain, it might be worth sitting down with a little bit of a list. And funny enough, in our full training course, we've actually got a whole module on this, sitting down with a tool and actually making some notes so that she can then try and see a pattern in the behaviour. And that way she might actually be able to develop an intervention that is a little bit more sophisticated than what she can do right now. And I really like, actually, that she's noticed that things are not quite as they seem, that what the student appears to be telling her what she seems to be seeing herself, it doesn't entirely make a lot of sense. And that's not because, Siobhan, anything's going wrong. It doesn't mean you're bad at your job. It means that there are things happening that are a little bit different to the norm. Thank you for noticing. Well done. Because now we can move beyond that and perhaps use a bit of logical thinking. In the moment, it's really hard sometimes to figure this stuff out. And certainly, particularly for a very young student, they have no idea. They can't tell us. And so thinking about that with a little bit more structure, using a tool such as the one we teach in our full course, that might actually be very useful, Siobhan.
Nice. And Judy's got, I think, quite a common question about time management. She says, I often have to make difficult decisions about who to support and who I spend my time with. It's very stressful. I know I'm doing my best, but is my best good enough?
Oh, I think it is. I think it is. Judy, wasn't it?
Yes.
So I think, Judy, you're doing a great job. The fact that you're asking yourselves this tough question, I think that means you've gone well beyond what is, enough. There are going to be classes where there's just more students with more need than we can immediately deal with. However, I think the thing to do here is to actually think about what's in common between some of your students, what things might actually be a little bit the same, even if we don't know for sure, and start to think about little interventions that can preempt things for groups of students, if not the whole class. Because I think if we're thinking about patterns and groups, we might be able to reduce our workload a little bit and actually solve problems at a more universal level and start to really clear the decks of some of the things that are happening for multiple students, little groups of students, so that we can then deal more effectively with the stuff that lets over. But Judy, even if that's not actually possible for you, I think you're doing really great, and thank you for doing it.
Next question I've got is from Susan. She asks, how can I authentically challenge a gifted student? I don't want to give him more of the same or ask him to help any of the students who are struggling.
This is a good one. So I think for this one, I'm actually going to disagree with this teacher a little bit. So thank you for sending this in so I can do that. I think that probably the thing to do is actually to challenge that assumption about the student totally shouldn't be helping other students. Because if we're talking about a neurodiverse student, we're probably talking about somebody that needs a little bit of help with their relationships with their peers. And so the structure around using their spare time to help other students, I think that's a really great setup because it's going to make the teacher's job easier. It's going to build relationships between that student and other people. It's going to show that student that they can be trusted by the teacher, they can be trusted by others. It's going to demonstrate that to the class. Here is somebody that can help us with our everyday lives as opposed to somebody that's a little bit different or whatever it is. So I actually think that the right answer here is to think about using the student as a resource rather than creating more work for the student instead, or trying to do something a little bit different. All those things are valuable, but if you've got two problems you can solve with the one action, that seems like a good place to start. And specifically for neurodiversity, that sort of structure around providing support is going to be absolutely brilliant.
Nice. Kat asks, how do you really know when an autistic student has completely generalized a skill?
Well, it's an interesting one, Kat. And so the thing that stands out to me for this one is that actually I think that we've got a bit of an assumption to challenge there as well. You actually can't reliably tell ever that you're going to be able to generalise any skill. If we are learning something and then we go into space, it's going to be different. We're not going to be able to generalise it to space where things are moving around. So there's going to be lots of times where we can't tell for sure. I think what Kat's after here, Kat wasn't? I think what Kat's after here is certainty. And I understand that. That seems very fair, but we're never going to get certainty, Kat. So I think the thing to do is think about all of the known situations where the skill might be needed, where you have some kind of need for the certainty you're after. Maybe talk to the parent about the situations at home where a similar thing, and then that's close enough. I think we should stop looking for situations that we're not yet aware of. If something comes up, like let's say you're about to go on an excursion, maybe that's a good time to ask about, well, are there particular skills that we might need to look at again? But other than that, you've done a great job. Just continue on and do something else.
Nice. Sam C., I think he's a history teacher. He says, I get excited about the content. I relate it to my students' lives, current events, things like that. But he's got one girl who never engages, she never shows any interest, total apathy. Why is she choosing to miss out?
Okay, I'm sensing a theme here in some of these questions. So I think with this one, again, there's a little bit of an assumption there, Sam, that we might need to look at for a second, and that's that your student is actually apathetic and is choosing, and it's a very specific word, to miss out. I actually think that the student is showing up to class, is not having any behavioural problems that I'm aware of in this setup. And so I think what that means is actually there probably is a little bit of interest, and what we might have here is a lot of anxiety. We might have some problems with contributing in the way that other students do to the class Seems like there's a bit of discussion going on from what I'm hearing. So maybe there are some things that we might need to think about in terms of barriers for this student, rather than look at the apparent end result of apathy. We might need to backtrack a little bit. So perhaps the first thing to do is to actually think about the relationship with the student. Let's not worry about the content right now. Let's just put that on hold. You're obviously very good at that, and that's great. Let's think about what we can do to build the relationship with the student. Maybe a little bit of private time, encouraging the student to talk about their life, maybe talk about some of the things that are going on in other aspects of their experience at school, and just understanding that there might be some opportunities there to get the student to open up a bit. You might find in doing so, you'll get the answers you're looking for about what those barriers might be. They could well actually be obvious. So hopefully that's useful, Sam.
Next question is from Riley. He sounds a little bit riled up.
Okay.
What can I do to stop my automatic "I'm the boss" responses? I start thinking, I'm a 25-year veteran and you're a 12-year-old kiddo. So when I ask you to do something, you should just bleep and do it.
That's good. I love the honesty there. Thank you, Riley, wasn't it?
Yes.
Thank you, Riley. That's great. So, that seems like a very fair question to be asking. Like, it's the 25,000th time. Really, really, really. And so I understand. So if I understand correctly, it's the automatic part that Riley's talking about.
I'm the boss, and it sounds like he's saying, I'm the boss and I'm in charge, don't question me. And he might be getting a bit angry and having that kind of emotional reactive response.
And I think, do I hear correctly that he's asking how not to do that? Is that the one?
Yeah, he wants to know how he can relax that automatic "I'm the boss" response.
Oh, Riley, I love you so much, because that insight is really, really great. Well done. You're actually most of the way there, because what that means is that you can start thinking about what are my triggers, number one, and then we can look at, well, do we need a proactive response? So we set things up a little bit better so that the trigger is less likely to occur. So this might be something about setting up some expectations in your classroom so that most people tend to do what they tend to do, which is the right thing, as much as they can. And so that might take the edge off a little bit. And then if we're thinking about something's happened anyway, maybe you could spend a little bit of time doing privately some breathing exercises, just something to give yourself a little bit of a pause mentally. And if you practice that for a while, Riley, what you'll probably find is that that's a skill that you can bring out of your personal toolbox when you need it. Interrupt that kind of automatic, hang on to go on the boss stuff that starts up. Seems like you're very aware of that. And hopefully, if we're using some breathing exercises, over time we'll probably find, Riley, that is starting to become a bit easier to divert into the skill you've taught yourself, a little bit of breathing, and then you can start thinking a bit more constructively about whatever the trigger is that's gone on. So hopefully that's helpful, Riley.
And I've got a comment just coming in now from Alex. When you teach children with autism, you cannot get emotionally involved if you want to survive. What are your thoughts on this comment, David?
I've just been saying a bunch about relationships here, haven't I? So, Alex,
Yes.
Alex, I think there's a lot of truth to that, but any relationship with anybody is going to have some kind of emotional connection. If it doesn't matter how deep and meaningful it is necessarily, there is an emotional connection there. And so I think my proposition to you is that actually it's about not becoming overly emotionally involved in the life of your student, not being so kind of open to them that their bad day, whatever's going wrong for them at home, potentially maybe in another class, is then emotionally impacting on you. So there needs to be a little of that distance. That I agree with. But I think that if we're cutting ourselves off from our students, it's actually going to deny us the opportunity to be part of their personal growth, to watch them develop. And I think that it's also going to make it really hard for the student, particularly a neurodiverse student, to get some kind of understanding that you care about them. And so that's going to make things, if anything, a bit more challenging, because the opportunity to use the relationship to start to encourage personal growth will not be there if we're just completely cut off. So I understand the impulse to not become emotionally over-involved, but I also think there's a need for a strong emotional, empathetic connection with every student, and particularly neurodiverse students. And so what I would encourage you to do, Alex, is to maybe talk to a colleague about ways that they can strike that balance. They're doing that, and maybe start to think yourself about how you might like to set that boundary. I think the boundary is important, without cutting yourself off from all of the benefits that might come from some emotional connection with your student.
That's a great answer. I've got one last question on our chat thread here from Philippa. What can I do about someone who can't handle change in the classroom? For example, I tied my hair back one day and she, the student, kept touching it all day because she didn't like it. Quite funny, actually, but everything has to be the same for her.
Yeah, so this is a good... I love that story, by the way. That's really great.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I think with this one, it sounds like the student's fairly young, be my guess. I don't imagine having a 14-year-old touch your hair is very appropriate, so probably very young. So I think with this one, we need to start thinking about opportunities to expose this student to very, very, very small changes so they can get used to the idea that change is actually okay. And so your hair is actually probably a good thing. Maybe keep doing that initially, because she's used to the idea that the teacher may now come in with different hair. Assume it's a girl. Is it a girl?
Yeah, from Philippa, I think so.
I'm still paying attention. So I think that might be something to actually do again, maybe a different type of hair, and then just look at how that's going, and look at maybe also some setup. Change is about to happen. Here's what it's going to be, so that when it happens, the student is not as surprised by it, and build a little bit of that into the schedule, so that the idea that change is a thing that happens in class and it's okay and it's totally normal, that can start to become a little bit of a routine for this particular student. So I wouldn't encourage large changes, like change the schedule. Maybe what we might do to start with is just have different coloured post-it notes each day on her desk. That would be fine. Let's just start really, really small and see how we can encourage the student to think about change in those very small ways. So they're building a skill set around change is happening. Oh, okay, not as ridiculous as it could be, and I don't really need to touch the teacher's hair. That doesn't seem like a good idea to keep on going with if the student grows older and hasn't had that learning experience. So it's a great story to finish on. So very good. No more questions, I go. We're out of time, so thank you. So folks, if you've got more questions, you've got the email address below. It's ask@aspurposeful.com.au. If we get enough of them, we'll do another Q&A. I'll talk a little bit more, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.